Hello and welcome to this, the third episode of the Not a Day for Soundbites podcast. In this episode, I will be exploring a speech that generated great public interest at the time it was given, as Labour and its leader seemed on the brink of power. It was given at the same time that Bill Clinton was earning his nickname of the Comeback Kid. I am of course referring to Tony Blair's 1996 Labour Party conference speech, the Education speech.
The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
Education, and education.
You start with far-fetched resolution. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma called. And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real need.
We've changed the world before, and we're going to change the world again.
This episode of the podcast has been produced as part of the University of Warwick's Undergraduate Research Support Scheme project, History 1997 and All That. More information on this project and where you can find out more about it will be given at the end of this episode. The path that brought Anthony Charles Linton Blair to that moment in 1996 and to his eventual landslide victory at the 1997 general election is a long and complex one. Born in Edinburgh, raised in Durham and for a time in Australia, educated at Fetters and Oxford, Blair's journey to the leadership of a political party was not perhaps unusual. He was, however, in many ways, the opposite of his immediate predecessors, Neil Kinnock and John Smith. The fiery Welsh orator and the carefully considered Scottish lawyer certainly had different upbringings from Blair, but they each understood that for the Labour Party to succeed, perception was as important as policy. To understand both the 1996 speech and the 1997 election, it is therefore crucial to recognise the perception of Blair and the speech was as important as the policy that lay behind it. Blair first entered Parliament as an MP in 1983. He had previously contested the safe Conservative seat of Beaconsfield in 1982, in which he and Labour lost their deposit. It would be the only time in Blair's electoral career that he would lose an election. During the campaign, Blair was aided by his father-in-law, the actor Tony Booth, and Booth's partner, the actress Pat Phoenix. Their presence, alongside that of the then Labour leader Michael Foot, helped boost Blair's recognition to the public and media. Blair and Foot had a common liking for P.G. Wodehouse, and following lunch in a Beaconsfield pub with the candidate, Foot would make a prophetic comment about Blair's future.
Could I ask you, how have you found your day here at the Beaconsfield by-election?
Well, I think it's been a pretty good day. First of all, we've got a wonderful candidate. Everybody agrees that Tony Blair is one of the very best possible candidates there could be, and we are very proud of everything he's been saying here, and whatever the result, we believe that he's going to have a very big future in British politics. Following the 82 loss, Blair gained the nomination for the safe Labour seat of Sedgefield, not far from his childhood home of Durham. While standing in Sedgefield, his wife Sherry Blair was also standing for Labour in the Conservative safe seat of North Thanet. Sherry Blair lost, but Tony Blair won, setting him on his path to power. That path to power began when he first met Gordon Brown, whom he shared an office with during the initial 1983 to 1987 Parliament. A version of this first meeting was dramatised by Stephen Frears in his 2003 drama, The Deal.
Have you got a moment? It seems we have an accommodation problem. Dave Nellist, Trotskyite Solidarity, Coventry South East, has been put in an office with a new fella from Sedgefield. Not a marriage made in heaven. The Chief Whip was wondering if you'd take him in here.
Who, Nellis?
Oh, no, the other one.
Where?
You could make room that side of the desk. Besides, you knew you'd have to share eventually. You like him. He's a lawyer. Very bright.
Well, tell him to give me a call.
Actually, I have him here with me now.
Hi, Tony Blair. Thanks for agreeing to this.
Right. I'll leave you to it.
Thanks, John. Well, I like the view.
So what did you do to upset Dave Nellis?
Do? Nothing. Let's just say our political philosophies didn't match.
From London, aren't you?
Yes. Although, originally I was brought up in Durham, and I was actually born in Scotland, which, technically, I suppose, makes me Scottish. What about you?
Technically, I believe I'm Scottish too.
Though, as has been recounted both by those who knew Blair and Brown at the time and subsequent historians, Brown was seen as the senior member of the partnership. It would prove to be Blair who was better able to capture television screens and audiences. Whilst there is a great deal of retroactive attempts, particularly by those in certain sections of the Labour Party, particularly on the left of the Labour Party, to position Blair as purely as a Thatcherite who was somehow insidiously attempting to change the Labour Party to mirror the Conservatives, this is not only untrue, but fails to understand Blair's initial appeal to TV producers, the media and audiences during the 1980s. As the clip I'm about to play demonstrates, Blair was a regular critic of Margaret Thatcher's government and used the briefs that were given to him as an MP and then within the shadow cabinet, whatever they were, to attack Margaret Thatcher and her government.
Privatisation can damage your health, and it certainly will do for some of those small investors now.
And privatisation, if it fails, would certainly damage the government's health, wouldn't it?
It blows a gaping big hole in the government proceeds, and of course we have always said it's wholly wrong for the government to be selling off assets and using them for revenue purposes, and the difficulties that we've had over the past couple of days simply illustrate that.
This is not a singular example either, as this clip from 1988, a year after the previous clip, demonstrates.
The truth is that their original proposals were the product of the furniture manufacturers' lobby, who virtually packed the government's working party. There was only one fire officer actually represented on that working party. We have learnt today that the minutes of the government's working party were in fact written by the industry representatives. Now, all this adds up to a very, very sorry tale indeed, and the government clearly bowed to vested interest instead of the public's interest.
The Blair of the 1980s was as much of a trench fighter in Labour's fight against the Conservatives as any other member of Labour's shadow cabinet. Indeed, during the 1987 election campaign, Blair, as a front-bench spokesperson, made one of the most memorable attacks on Margaret Thatcher, referring to her as having an unchecked and unbalanced mind, a quote that ensured his entry into Rodney Tyler's authoritative book on the 1987 Conservative election campaign. In fact, Blair is mentioned more in that book than Thatcher's immediate successor, John Major, who isn't mentioned at all. Blair gets a single mention. The Blair of the 1980s was therefore keenly aware of how important the media was to forming the public's perception of a politician, and he used that media spotlight to enhance his reputation and to carve out a niche for himself in terms of being often the Labour politician who would be seen most on television screens. Blair's star, however, would not become truly ascendant until after the 1992 general election. Whilst during the 1987 election campaign, both Neil Kinnock and his team had been aware that Labour's chances of winning outright in 1987 were remote, 1992 had been billed as the opportunity for Kinnock to finally become Prime Minister. However, John Major's much more grassroots campaign, which was unfavourably compared to, as the media perceived it, Kinnock's more presidential presentation of himself and of Labour's policies, cost Labour the 92 election. Though, of course, it was not by much. 92 wasn't in the same way as 83 or 87 a Conservative landslide. The Conservatives still had a majority, but it was a greatly reduced one. In the wake of the 1992 election, Blair was present on the BBC to spin Labour's defeat, and he made this remark.
No, I think it was that, in some ways, the Conservatives, I think most people believe, did not deserve to win the election, but the question was ultimately whether people were prepared to come in sufficiently great numbers for the Labour Party, for Labour actually to win power. And as I say, if you actually look at the number of seats we gained, it was very considerable. If you look at the number of seats the Conservatives lost, it was very considerable. But coming from where we were back in the first defeat of 83 and then 87, we couldn't make that final leap, not in the sufficient numbers that we required to win an overall majority or indeed to put the Conservatives out of office. Now, of course, that's a tremendous disappointment. It would be rather strange if it wasn't to us, since we fought, in many ways, a very good campaign. But I do think it should be balanced and measured against that sense of achievement, and also the fact that we won seats in all parts of the country. And we won seats down in the southwest, we won seats in London, which I think was very important, and of course we won seats in the northwest and Midlands and the north too.
As Blair demonstrates in this clip, he was conscious that Labour had not, at least to the public's mind, changed enough to be entrusted with office again. These thoughts had been present in Blair's mind throughout his time in Parliament. Indeed, in a 1987 opinion piece for the New Statesman on electoral reform, he offered the opinion: the real question for the Labour Party is why it is not achieving sufficient electoral support. It must face this question irrespective of whether we retain the present electoral system or change it, whether we stand for election alone or in a pact. The campaign for PR is just the latest excuse for avoiding decisive choices about the party's future. Blair's desire for further modernisation would provoke him in attempting to convince Gordon Brown to stand for the leadership against then favourite John Smith during the 1992 Labour Party leadership election. Blair saw himself as potentially standing for the deputy leadership alongside Brown, therefore creating a modernising ticket. Brown's demurring frustrated Blair, and from then on he became determined to finish the modernising job himself and do it in his own way. It was as Smith's shadow Home Secretary that Blair really began to shine, his talent for public speaking coming to the forefront through both his clashes with the then Home Secretary Michael Howard in the House of Commons and various appearances on the media, on television, on TV news, on the radio, etc. Blair's positioning of himself ensured that following the tragic death of John Smith in 1994, he was perfectly placed to take over for him and lead Labour into the next election. By the time of the 1996 conference speech, sense of the scale of Labour's potential victory was clearly in the air. Unlike Margaret Thatcher, who liked to call an election a year before the end of a parliament, John Major realised that the best hope for the Conservatives to stay in office was that they had to postpone an election as long as possible and hope that Blair and Labour's resonance with the nation would fade. It didn't. Despite mockery of Blair as Tony Blair, Bambi, or similar attempts to mock him in one way or another, the public continued to like Blair and want him and Labour to win the next election. Poll after poll showed Labour were ahead, and as Blair began the speech that would in part define his coming premiership, thanks to the three words, or rather the repeated phrase, education, 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 Labour were 25 points ahead of the Conservatives. Blair began his speech by reminding the conference not only of how long the Conservatives had been in government, but also his ambition to bring Labour into it.
This year, we meet as the opposition. Next year, the British people willing, an end to 18 years of the Tories, and we will meet as the new Labour government of Britain.
What it is important to stress in looking at, in reviewing this opening extract, is the mixture of ambition and humility that Blair was so easily able to personify during his time in opposition and then later, to an extent, in government. He makes clear both that his aim is to form the next government, but he also reminds the conference that they can only win there can only be the next government if the British people willing choose Labour, clearly attempting to paint himself as a servant of the people, in contrast to the Conservatives. He reinforces this in the next extract when he references John Smith's final speech before his early tragic death.
All I ask is the chance to serve.
What Blair expresses skillfully in this section is that he is not the sole architect of New Labour or of Labour's revived performance as a political party, but rather that he is the latest standard bearer of Labour's modernisation movement. This allows Blair to not only paint himself as fitting into a pattern of change that made him look like the latest incarnation of Labour's journey back to government, but it also makes New Labour seem not simply about him, that it is a project that, whilst Blair is the front man of it, the lead singer, if you will, he's not the only person in the team, he's not the only person in the band. It is not a one-man band, it is a much deeper and much more complex project. And Blair understood that to be successful in government, he had to demonstrate that Labour would not simply consist of him making decisions alone, but rather that Labour as a whole party would be brought back into government, and that, the shadow cabinet would be a formidable and modernising government. It would not simply be Blair on his own making decisions, though of course later on, whilst in government, that was a criticism that was levelled at Blair, that he ran a sofa government. But at this time in his career, going into the next election, he was concerned with and wanting to promote Labour as not just about him, but a party that was renewed in its entirety. He then moves on to describe how he wanted to set out to raise all of the people of Britain up, and that Labour must be focused on the future. Blair's phrase, 1,000 days to prepare for 1,000 years, underpins this particular message.
And at the time of the next election, there will be just 1,000 days until the new millennium. 1,000 days to prepare for 1,000 years.
Blair's use of the metric 1,000 days is particularly interesting given the emphasis placed by many commenters at the time on how presidential the speech was. It can be said to evoke the first 100 days, which was the metric that each president since FDR had been judged by, but also the phrase 1,000 days had been applied to President Kennedy's 1,000 days in office. So there is a sense of drawing on some of the great presidents of American politics, some of the great figures in American politics in this phrase. Of course, it also gives the speech a sense of place in history. Both from this section and from the rest of the speech, it is clear that Blair is aware of his place in history, that he's aware that he could be, if he wins this election, the first Prime Minister of the 21st century. And this dichotomy between the future and the past lie at the heart of the speech. Blair is aware that he wants to project Labour as a party of renewal, that it is New Labour, but at the same time, he doesn't want to make it seem as if New Labour is an entirely separate party from the Labour Party that previously existed. Blair then goes on to describe the differences between his party, the Labour Party, and the Conservatives. That the Conservatives are not the party of the future, but rather the party that is holding Britain back. He emphasises that he wants Britain to be a nation of achievers. He wants to mark a new age of achievement. The message of renewal, and with it new standards of achievement, are littered throughout the speech. Like Harold Wilson in 1964 and Clement Attlee in 1945, Blair's aim was to paint a comprehensive and ambitious programme for government, and one that could only be achieved by electing him and electing the Labour Party. He follows his initial section of the speech's open up by stating that he welcomed the ambassadors of the Israeli and Palestinian people to the Labour Party's conference and hoping that they will be able to end the tears and bloodshed of the past few days. Blair here is referencing the riots that occurred in September 1996 due to newly elected Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's opening of an exit in the Arab quarter of Jerusalem's West Wall tunnel. Blair then deftly links the continuing conflicts between the Israeli and Palestinian people to the continuing bitter conflict in Northern Ireland, reinforcing his belief that peace could be achieved and that he would work as hard as John Major to ensure that peace was found in Northern Ireland. Blair goes on to speak directly to Sinn Féin and says that you have your chance to take the path of peace. It is your duty to take it as members of the human race. Honour it and you shall play your part. Fail in that duty and I swear to you, the search for justice and reconciliation will carry on without you. The choice is yours. Blair's direct communication with Sinn Féin demonstrates not only his determination to resolve the matter regardless of who is present at the peace table, but also that he is aware of the similarities between the conflict in Northern Ireland and that occurring in Israel and those occurring in the Middle East. This section neatly and artfully conveys that Blair is a leader who can engage both in domestic and foreign affairs with ease, adding to the perception that he is a world leader in waiting. He then follows this up with a rehearsed but a nicely done bit of humour.
Sorry, you must be careful with these flashlights. It's making my eyes red. It's been a funny year for me. First it was Stalin. Then it was Kim Il-sung. And now it's the devil with the demon eyes. Look, can't we just go back to Bambi?
What Blair is demonstrating here is not only an ability to make fun of himself, but also that regardless of who is leader of the Labour Party, they will always be demonised in some way, and often compared to totalitarian left-wing figures. By utilising humour, Blair not only dismisses the accusations towards him, but makes them look completely and utterly ridiculous. He then follows this up by launching into a blistering attack on the Conservatives, describing how their record demonstrates the continued failure of the government to act in a way that gives the British public faith in them.
Look at them! The tax-cutting party that gave us the biggest tax rises in peacetime history. The law and order party that doubled crime and gave us a Home Secretary in court more often than the people he's supposed to be locking up.
The verbal brilliance of this section, and the one that follows it, is that Blair is attacking the Conservatives on much of their own territory, on taxation, on law and order, and on rural areas that rely on farming. By advancing into the Conservatives' own traditional areas of dominance, he's demonstrating not only their failings, but how Labour has changed as well. That the Labour Party is a party that not only notices these failures and points them out, but is concerned as to how to fix them. This is something that is apparent throughout the speech. Blair does not shy away from brutally dismantling the Conservatives, and in particular, John Major and Ken Clarke. Blair not only impugns Major's honesty by declaring that if he wants to be seen as an honest man, he must fight an honest campaign, and stating that Majorism stands for not the existence of a political philosophy, but the absence of one, is key to Blair's appeal, not just within the Labour Party, but as the public in general. He was showing that he would be willing to take on the Prime Minister and willing to point out Major's inadequacy for the job of Prime Minister. Blair similarly mocks Ken Clarke's use of the feel-good factor, a factor that the Conservatives hoped they would use to be able to win the 1997 election, by stating,
"Let us tell Kenneth Clarke and John Major, the real feel-good factor will arrive when the people of this country say goodbye to this government for good."
Whilst many see Blair and his time as leader of the Labour Party as an attempt to make the Labour Party more Toryfied, it is clear that this is inaccurate and fundamentally dishonest analysis. Blair, certainly here as well as in prior media appearances, never pulled his punches. Later in this speech, he states that the Conservatives caused 2 recessions, wiped out a third of Britain's manufacturing base, devalued the pound, and squandered North Sea oil. He argues that, unlike Labour, the Conservatives would make Britain a low-wage, low-skill, and low-technology economy. He succinctly argues that Labour is the party that can build a new age of achievement in a new and different world. This is not a Labour leader that is attempting to mollify the Conservatives or as to not criticise them or wanting to pull his punches. This is a Labour leader who is quite clearly out for the blood of the Conservative government, and when he sniffs it, goes for the jugular. And, looking at this speech, I think it is clear that even though it seemed as if Labour's victory was in some ways inevitable by the scale of the polling advantage that Labour had at this time over the Conservatives, Blair never lets up. He keeps going and going and going, because he knew that whilst this lead may seem insurmountable, it wasn't, and could quite easily have ended in the Conservatives winning that election, even though it seems incredible to us now, had Labour not been as focused as it was on detail and putting across its message. It is entirely possible that the Conservatives, had Labour not run a tight ship, been able to win that election if there had been any sort of failings on the part of Blair or the Labour Party. It is also interesting to note in this speech that Blair places an influence on technology and industry, and this is in some ways comparable to Harold Wilson's 1963 Scarborough speech. And it's interesting that, whilst, as we looked at in that episode, in the first episode of the series, the 1963 speech, it was clear that Wilson's barometer for technological improvement in Britain was at least comparable to the Soviet Empire and to the USSR. Blair here is very much focused not on comparing Britain to either Russia or the United States, but making it a trading and technological giant in its own right. It's also interesting in this next section of the speech that I'll just be reading out, that Blair wants to promote this moment as a moment in history equivalent to 1945 and 1964, again demonstrating that he was aware of the significance of this 1996 conference speech and its place and his place in history. He says, when making the comparison, "I know in my own constituency, the miners in 1945 who voted Labour did so that their sons would not have to go down the pit and work in the conditions that they had. And in 1964, their children voted Labour because they saw the next generation's chance to go to university and do better than their parents had done. The true radical mission of the Labour Party, new and old, is this: not to hold people back, but to help them get on. All people." Here, Blair is building upon the Labour Party's past to generate enthusiasm for the future. He is, in effect, speaking to both the conference and the public at large at the same time, whilst allowing 2 similar but slightly different things to be taken away from each group. For those at the conference, he's making clear that, despite the prefix new, the Labour Party he leads is in the same tradition as that of previous Labour governments, and that in terms of achievement and commitment, it is focused on improving the lives of working people. But to the general public, he's emphasising that their memories of the Labour Party should not be dominated by the winter of discontent or union strife in the 1970s, but of the hope and optimism that came with both Attlee and Wilson's first election victories. Blair followed this up by outlining that whilst it may seem as if people have prospered under the Conservatives, it is merely the wealthiest who'd been able to do well for themselves, whilst those on working income had suffered. Blair added that he did not want to add to their burden of taxation, whilst also making a clear commitment to business.
Labour is the party of small businesses in Britain today.
What is fascinating about this speech is how Blair manages to mix the traditional Labour causes of workers' rights with a more centre-ground and new Labour approach to business. He explicitly states that he does not want the party to be dragged into some of the old bitter union fights of the 1970s that so dominated Labour's last period in office.
Forget the past. No more bosses versus workers. We are on the same side, the same team, and Britain United will win.
Whilst Blair, in the clip that I've just played, seems to be wanting the party to move on from the union strife of the 1970s, to not see themselves as bosses versus workers, he's not neglecting the concerns of the unions or their members. He makes a commitment to ensure the restoral of full trade union rights to GCHQ workers, and states that whilst he advocates for and will implement a national minimum wage, he does not want anyone to think of the Labour Party as the political arm of anyone other than the British people. So there is this fascinating dichotomy between the focus on business and wanting to say that, look, Labour's changed, Labour is no longer the arm of the unions, it is merely representative of the British people. He's still giving a clear commitment to trade unions and wanting to emphasise that the Labour Party still supports trade unions and still wants to give the trade unions as much support as possible. He then turns his focus to education, advocating not only for smaller class sizes, but stating that it was vital that education was placed at the heart of the agenda for a Labour government. It is at this point in the speech he utters the famous phrase,
Ask me my 3 main priorities for government, and I tell you, education, education, and education.
The emphasis that Blair places on education is important, as it demonstrates a focus on not only an issue that it's the heart of British life, but in the wake of the horrific Dunblane mass shootings and the murder of Jamie Bulger, that the conditions and safety of children had to be viewed as more important than ever. It's fascinating as well to look at this speech and to look at the priorities that Blair was putting forward in the context of what would happen later on. Blair's legacy will, in many ways, primarily be dominated by foreign policy, by both the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. And yet, here it is clear that, strangely in a similar way to George W. Bush, who, again, also prior to his election in 2000, saw himself primarily as a domestic policy president, Blair also clearly sees himself as a domestic policy prime minister. Whilst there are mentions of foreign policy, and whilst there is clear focus on certain aspects of foreign policy, it's not central to his message, it's not central to his argument for the way that the Labour Party should go forward. He's clearly thinking about education, workers' rights, technology, things that are bread and butter domestic issues rather than foreign affair issues. He's not making a case in the same way that, for example, John F. Kennedy made during the 1960 presidential campaign on foreign affairs and using foreign affairs as the centre of his campaign, or even Margaret Thatcher in 1983 using the Falklands War as a image, as a poster for her campaign and for her government. Though, of course, in the 1983 campaign, she was also focusing on domestic issues as well, but the Falklands was very much a part of that campaign, and foreign affairs was quite important to the 1983 campaign in that way, in terms of conservative promotion, in a way that foreign affairs isn't an issue for Blair going forward to 1997. And Blair's commitment to making people safer, to making children safer, to making life in Britain safer, is reinforced by his commitment to ensuring the end of handguns, the banning of handguns.
Conservative MPs complain that our response has been emotional. Well, if they had been in that gym, if they had talked to those parents, sitting on those tiny chairs where once their children had sat, they would have been emotional too. I believe that we should ban the private ownership and possession of handguns.
And it is this focus on the primary issues, the bread and butter issues of education and crime, that resonate throughout this speech. And that is why it is such an effective speech, because the bread and butter issues are those that connect to people most readily. It's going to resonate with people much more to talk about crime and education, particularly as the Conservative government's record on both were severely declining in the late 1990s. But it also shows that the Labour Party is in touch with people at this time, that those who had drifted away during the Thatcher years could return to the Labour Party because Labour was focusing on the things that they cared about. Whereas the perception during previous times, previous years, previous elections, for some who had shifted to the Conservatives, who had voted for Margaret Thatcher and then potentially for John Major, was that the Labour Party was more concerned with things that weren't relevant to their lives. And this is why the 1996 speech is so important and so effective. It's because Blair is making clear that he understands what people are concerned with. And he's making that argument quite clearly and forcefully, both to the people and to the Labour Party conference in this speech. Of course, the speech received wide acclaim, and it was seen to demonstrate that both Labour and Blair were on the cusp of power. But what's also important to note about this speech is that it isn't a victory lap, but rather one that is continuing to reinforce why Blair and Labour believe the Conservatives had failed the British voter, and how by supporting Labour once more they could improve their lives. Blair hammers home the Conservatives have caused recession, they've squandered North Sea oil, they've dropped standards in terms of education, they're going to create a low-wage and low-technology economy. He's continually hitting the Conservatives with their failures. And this was key to how Blair was able to win in 1997, because he was so focused on the issues that the Conservatives were weakest on, rather than focusing on other issues that perhaps may have been more interesting to certain sections of the party. What is interesting about this speech is that it both uses history not just as a means of showing that the Conservatives have a record that could be criticised, but also a way of reminding voters of the achievements of Labour's past, and that, like those previous Labour governments, Blair's aim is to create generational change. Blair would ultimately bring about that change when, a year later, in May 1997, he won the single biggest one-party majority in modern British politics, bringing about 13 years of Labour government, the longest continuous period that the Conservatives were out of office since the 1740s. It is a record that has yet to be equalled in modern British politics. This episode was created as part of the University of Warwick's undergraduate support scheme project, History 1997 and All That, how the Labour Party used history to win in 1997. The project utilises primary source information and oral history transcripts from historians, politicians and those involved in the campaign to answer the question as to how much history influenced Labour's historic 1997 election landslide. For more information on this project, please head to the Twitter account for it at LabHistory1997. That's at LabHistory1997. More information related to the project can be found there. The next episode of this podcast will look at Harold Wilson's infamous 1967 pound in your pocket speech given when Wilson was forced to devalue the pound. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you will listen to the next one. If you wish to keep updated with the podcast, then you can do so by following me on Twitter at either at WBarberTaylor, that's at WBarberTaylor, or at the podcast's Twitter account, which is at NotADayPodcast. That's at NotADayPodcast. Thank you for listening. The next episode of the podcast will be with you shortly, much sooner than this episode has, as there has been quite a bit of a gap between this and the previous episode. Thanks again for listening.